Going to turn back to Exodus chapter 20, verse 13. It speaks about every life being sacred. It seems this commandment should be the easiest at one level to agree upon. You shall not murder. What other point of view could we take? Yet if an observer from some other mythical planet was to come down and observe planet Earth, they might wonder in recent years if that was the view of all humanity. To use the word civilized with humanity in too many situations around the world in our treatment of other people or animals or the planet is not really an accurate description. There is so much that we find unacceptable, and how much more God does. The word used here in Exodus 20, ratzah, is used with reference to the killing of humans, specifically, not with reference to the killing of animals. When reference is made to the killing of animals for food or sacrifice, a different word, Hebrew word, is used. This word is used always with reference to the unlawful killing of others. There are a couple of exceptions. But the focus here in this commandment is you shall not murder. It's not you shall not kill. And the distinction's important. So what is it saying? So is killing lawful in any particular circumstances? Well, there's animal sacrifices in the Old Testament. The Hebrew word shakat was used exclusively for animal sacrifices. What was the point of those sacrifices? To show how seriously God took sin and the consequences that flow from sinful behavior. But those were never sufficient. There was always more needed. Pointed forward, thank God, to the coming of Jesus and his perfect sacrifice for sin, that once for all time took away the problem that needed to be dealt with by animal sacrifices. Killing lawful in other circumstances, animals killed for food and clothing. In Genesis 3:21 it says, the Lord God made garments of skin for Adam and his wife and clothed them. It's permissible to use animal products for food and clothing. Of course, there's reference in the Bible to alternative diets, but neither those who eat meat nor those who abstain from it should judge others for their choices, as Paul speaks about that in Romans chapter 14. And legal punishment for the crime of murder. Although the Lord did not choose, interestingly, to execute the first recorded murderer, Cain, instead placing him under some kind of life sentence within the wider community. By the time of Noah, the death penalty was formally instituted. And in the New Testament, Paul warned that the state had the right to bear the sword. It's because God values life so highly that there's this commandment and the challenge of how we keep life sacred and value it. There are other offenses in the Old Testament for which the death penalty was enforced. And although we may think, well, that's a bit harsh, when we come to our own society and we see, say, a drunk driver killing a family on the road and getting a very modest sentence, we can think the punishment doesn't seem to fit the crime of the loss that's been incurred. These issues are incredibly difficult, however you look at it. And of course, it doesn't bring back the life that's been taken, whatever sentence is imposed on those whose actions have led to the deaths. And the last one, of course, is lawful killing in a time of war. Throughout the Bible, it's assumed the state has the right to use arms for defense in a just and proportionate war. Now, in the early couple of centuries, probably a majority of Christians were pacifists. But the majority view over the centuries since have been a belief in just war, in the defense of the realm. Interestingly, when John the Baptist had soldiers come up to him and said, "What should we do? How should we live out our faith?" He didn't say, "Leave the army." He said, "Don't extort money, don't accuse people falsely, and be content with your pay." There's a place for armed forces in times of defending the realm. So what's the heart issue that causes this commandment to be given? Why murder is wrong? It's a violation of the image of God. That is the fundamental principle that comes right at the beginning of Genesis. God said, "Let us make humanity in our image, in our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air," and so on. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female. He created them. Every human being is special because we're created in God's image. And that impacts how we are to relate to other people. And when Jesus, as I'll come to that later, mentions about unjust anger, it's because that person's created in the image of God that we treat them with dignity and respect. That's why the scenes in the White House this week caused such anger and sadness because of a lack of respect in that context, and so many more. How you and I value and treat other people, even those we struggle to get on with, even those who may totally disagree with the choices they're making, they are created in God's image. And I have to treat them in the light of that. Doesn't mean if someone does something significantly wrong that we have to walk by on the other side and leave it. That's a different matter altogether. But it's remembering they're created in God's image. Why is murder wrong? It's an action that cannot be undone. There's some things we can do and we can put it right. But if a life's taken, we cannot bring it back. In this life, we have only one life to live. Interestingly, although the death penalty was in place in the Old Testament, the safeguards against a conviction were much stronger than the United Kingdom in the last 2 centuries when the death penalty was lawful. Confession evidence was inadmissible. A person wasn't required or their evidence allowed to testify against themselves. And there had to be 2 primary witnesses. That was a much stronger threshold than in our own courts. It's because of the value of life that strict test was placed in the Old Testament. And of course it's wrong because it transcends more than just the individual who's killed. The impact on family, on communities, and so on is so great. You can mention people like Ian Brady and Myra Hindler, Fred West, those who killed Jamie Bulger, or the Dunblane massacre. We just start mentioning some of these, and you realize the ripples of the taking of life. But what's prohibited by the commandment? So it's premeditated killing. We do not have the right to take the life of someone created in the image of God. In the world in which these commandments were given, there was a constant tit for tat. If someone's injured or killed in a community, in their clan, they would then say they would have to do that to someone in the other clan. But then it would be returned, and an endless cycle of violence. So the lex talionis, the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, was to say any kind of justice must be proportionate to the crime that's been committed, and no more. And that was a remarkable change. That kind of honor killing and responses still happens in parts of the world to this day. The principle of justice and of punishment fitting a crime is behind those sanctions that were put in place in Exodus 21. In every cultural context, that can be difficult to work out what is proportionate in terms of punishment for crime. And there'll be arguments and discussions and debates about that in different cultures and contexts. But behind it all, because of the preciousness of life created in the image of God and seeking justice, those principles apply down the centuries. A person who willfully and callously takes the life of another deserves the full sanction of the law brought down upon them. What's also prohibited? Loss of life through thoughtless behavior. We've got a duty of care to other people. Now, over the years, when our children were younger, we used to love watching Mr. Bean films. They're really funny. Other films are available that are also funny. But there's one where Mr. Bean's going down the road, he's late for an appointment, and he gets dressed in the car. Now, it's fun watching it, and of course that was filmed at an old aerodrome, not on the public highway. But the risk of doing that in real life on the A92, it just doesn't even bear thinking about. You just don't do that. Health and safety legislation is there for a reason. It's there in the Old Testament, in Deuteronomy 22. If you're building a house, about building the parapet, they had flat-roofed houses. You build the fence around the top so people don't fall off and injure themselves. There's an example in Exodus 21 about duty of care to other people. You're digging a pit or something similar, and it causes injury to an animal. You've got to pay compensation. You had a duty of care to ensure there was not that injury, the potential for that to take place. Or if you had a dangerous animal, Exodus 21, another part of that chapter, you had to keep it under control so there was not a risk to other people or other animals. Now there's more complex cases. A thief that's caught breaking in Exodus 22, and different punishments depending whether it's day or at night. But grappling with the fact that our responsibility of caring for other people created in the image of God means that our behavior should be thought full, not thought less, doing what is right. More complex issues that come up when we think of abortion. Evangelical Christians have been united in our conviction of being pro-life, and Roman Catholics have been known for that for longer and more prominently. But teaching that life begins at conception, and that children in the womb that become conscious of the world around them, and that we should care for them. Now, there are very challenging situations where a mother's life may be in danger, or whether an act of rape has taken place, or a child's diagnosed with such serious health issues that they may not live to term. These are incredibly difficult situations, but in many cases that's not an issue. And on a pastoral note, there's no sin that cannot be forgiven. And when we make judgments in this or any other area, there can be professional counselling, but also God can forgive and give us a fresh start. Or a current issue, euthanasia, or assisted dying legislation at present. Again, incredibly complex individual situations. And we cannot deny that some people face incredibly tough times. The question of how we frame national legislation in such contexts, the big debate at present, if you've been listening to any of the debates on that, there are some incredibly complex issues. Please pray for our politicians as they work through that. There's been some very good contributions in that debate. But the elephant in the room in the discussion is that though we have in places good palliative care, for which we thank God, it's not equally accessible across the country. And the cutbacks financially that have reduced what's available is so wrong. What's needed at this time is for everyone across the country to have access to palliative care where that's needed, for it to be funded properly and not just depending on charitable fundraising. And the issue of suicide, that horrendously difficult situation. It's not right to take a life, including our own, but a person who takes their own life, we would generally understand as not being in their right mind to take such a step. But for such people and their families, we can only have the deepest sympathy. A more challenging issue is enjoying murderous entertainment. Seneca, the tutor of the Roman Emperor Nero, he was the first to raise questions about the gladiatorial contest where they put on the games for the fun of the people, where people were fighting themselves, other people, or fighting animals. He said that's damaging to people, thinking this is entertainment. And we tend to agree with him, of course, on that matter. But in our own society, when we watch films, where's the line drawn between legitimate portrayals of life and gratuitous violence? In video games, is it just fun? Where's the line as to what is appropriate games and what is not? In warfare, it's not just soldiers on battlefields. You can have drone operators hundreds or thousands of miles away doing stuff, and they just see a screen like a game. Where are the lines to be drawn? These get incredibly complicated. How, in such contexts, is that focal point on life being sacred, that humans are created in God's image, and our responsibility to care for one another and, of course, for creation as well? Something else that's also condemned is inactivity in the face of evil. It's not always doing something. Sometimes it's not doing anything. Srebrenica, July 1995. Remember the situation? Muslim community in northern Bosnia. There were Dutch peacekeepers there from the wider United Nations community, but they stood by while there were people massacred. But it's not only been there. It's wrong to allow evil to happen and say nothing. Now, it doesn't have to be as serious as that for it to be wrong. There are much smaller incidents that we should speak out against. But it's very, very difficult. As the peacekeepers testified in Srebrenica, there was too few of them against a larger military force. It could have cost them all their lives and achieved nothing. So there are difficult choices to make. And of course, inappropriate anger that Isdale raised in our old age talk about self-control of our emotions. Now, anger can be and is a legitimate response to some situations. If there's nothing you get angry over, then you've got a bigger problem than you ever realized. Out of 455 times in the Bible, the word anger is used. 375 of those about God getting angry about injustice, hypocrisy, or some other form of sinful conduct. God gets really angry about some stuff that happens on earth, and it's right and proper that we too get angry too. But it's how we express that anger that's really important. And that ability to control our own emotions can be at times very, very difficult. American President Abraham Lincoln had a Secretary of War called Edwin Stanton, and he really didn't get on with a major general in the American Army. These guys really just clashed something horrible. The officer wrote a letter to Stanton that was really abusive, really unpleasant. And he comes to complain to the president. The president says, this is what you should do. Write a letter back. You return it with interest. You really put out your feelings there. Really go for it in the letter. That's my summary, not his words. And he writes the letter. Tells the president, I've written the letter. Right, he said, burn it. Now write back a considered, appropriate response and not lowering yourself to the tone of the person who wrote the letter. He was a wise man. In the age of Facebook, Twitter, and other social media, how we respond is such a challenge. But James reminds us in James 1:19, my dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. When we have anger issues to address, or situations to avoid or tread carefully that can trigger unhelpful emotions or responses, to ask God for wisdom. This commandment, you shall not murder, it seems so simple. But as we start to look at life, it gets incredibly complicated at times. But to ask God, help me to remember at the heart of the commandment is a people created in your image and therefore are precious, deserve to be treated well, and to apply that in each area of our lives. Amen. Our questions, reflection. Why is life so precious? How would you answer this question if someone asked you? Does it raise questions about what we watch for entertainment or the games we play online? And Jesus' words about unjustified anger, do they raise any questions about our own self-control? Have a few moments to reflect on these questions before we come to communion.